Erythrocytes, otherwise known as red blood cells or RBCs, are the most abundant formed element in the blood. Oops. So if we look on the picture here, each of these red circles here is an erythrocyte. So you can see that overall there are significantly more erythrocytes than there are leukocytes or white blood cells. The main function of the red blood cells is that they transport oxygen and carbon dioxide through the blood. So the red blood cells transport oxygen from the lungs to the different cells in the body. The body cells use that oxygen in order to make energy in the form of ATP, and carbon dioxide is produced as a byproduct of that production of energy or ATP. So the carbon dioxide then diffuses from the cells into the bloodstream, where it's transported back to the lungs where it can be exhaled. We need some carbon dioxide in our blood, but if we have too much, if we have too much, it can cause problems. If we don't have enough, it can also cause problems. Red blood cells typically stay contained within blood vessels, so they don't move into the extracellular fluid. They stay within the blood vessels themselves, and they only live for about 120 days. So your body is constantly making new red blood cells, and the old ones they get worn out, and then they get broken down, and either the components are excreted or they're recycled to make other red blood cells. Mature red blood cells don't have a nucleus, and they don't have most organelles. That's because they are jam-packed with this protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the protein that can bind to oxygen. And so the more hemoglobin you have, the more oxygen a red blood cell can carry. One key thing with hemoglobin is that you have to have iron in order to make it. So this is one reason why iron is an important nutrient in your diet. And in some cases, you may need to take iron supplements or get iron injections if you are anemic or if your body is not able to make enough hemoglobin. Hemoglobin looks brighter red when oxygen is bound to it, and it's kind of a darker, maybe like a purple type red when it's carrying less oxygen. This is one reason why this darker red, it kind of looks blue through your skin. And so veins typically look blue through the skin, whereas arteries they're actually harder to see because they tend to be a little bit deeper in the body, but they would be brighter red in color. If you ever cut yourself and you're bleeding, you can see a difference between the blood as it's coming out as well. So each one of these red blood cells has about 300 million hemoglobin molecules, and that's only in one cell. And remember, we've got lots of these in our blood. So each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 atoms of oxygen. So each one of these red blood cells can carry about 1.2 billion oxygen atoms. So that's a pretty significant amount of oxygen that can be carried in our blood. Now, like with most things in the body, if you have too much erythrocytes, or I guess too many erythrocytes, or not enough erythrocytes, it can cause problems. So the first potential disorder is anemia. So anemia is where you don't have enough red blood cells, or you might have enough red blood cells, but you don't have enough hemoglobin in those red blood cells. So if we look at our blood that has been centrifuged, we can see that this is normal. Whereas in this case here, this person is anemic. So their blood doesn't have enough red blood cells. And you can imagine if you don't have enough red blood cells, you're not getting oxygen to your body cells and your brain and your muscles and your heart as efficiently as you should. And so the symptoms associated with anemia are generally caused by a decrease in the oxygen delivery. So, some common symptoms include fatigue, headaches and irritability, shortness of breath, inability to think clearly, and if it stays too low for too long, it can result in death. So if you've ever gone, maybe driven up to Flagstaff, or if you drive up a mountain You may be familiar with altitude sickness, where as you go up in elevation, you tend to be more tired, you might get a headache or something like that. And that's because as you go higher up in elevation, you actually need more red blood cells. So if your body is adapted to living at sea level and then you drive up a mountain, even though you've got enough red blood cells for being at sea level, you might not have enough red blood cells in order for you to function at 100% up at elevation. Now, as much as not having enough red blood cells is bad, having too many can also be a problem. So polycythemia is a disorder in which there are too many red blood cells. And this can be caused by dehydration, which would be pretty easy to solve by either an IV or just drinking more fluids. There are certain diseases that cause an overproduction of red blood cells. And also living at high altitude. So if you live in Colorado or Flagstaff or somewhere that is at a high elevation or altitude, your body's going to make more red blood cells, but that's actually considered normal in that situation. And it's because as you go up in elevation, there's less oxygen in the air, so your body makes more red blood cells so that you can basically hold on to as much oxygen as you can get into your body. So mild polycythemia is normal in people that live at high altitudes. But overall, if it gets too high, the problem is that it makes the blood thicker. And if the blood is thicker, it doesn't move through the blood vessels as easily as it should, and your heart has to work harder in order to pump it. So imagine trying to squeeze water out of a balloon versus trying to squeeze something like maple syrup out of a balloon. It would be harder to get all the maple syrup out, whereas the water would come out a lot easier.